The next session that I'd like to introduce is entitled Putting the U in CCUS. Today, utilization of CO2 is primarily in the form of enhanced oil recovery. Tomorrow, the opportunities are limitless. This session will explore EOR and the potential for viable options and the economic impact outside of EOR. And our distinguished panel includes, to my left, Dr. Kelly Tambamitu, to my right, Francis Leneuf, and to my left, Dr. John Morano from JM Energy. I should say Francis is the Director of Conventional Oil and Gas East Synovus. Kelly is the Chairman of the IEA Greenhouse Gas R&D Program. So now I'd like to invite Kelly to come up to make his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nick. Before I start on my presentation, I would like to deliver a big thank you to SaskPower. As you heard from John Gale this morning, SaskPower has been in this business for, I think, about close to 25 years, the CO2 business that is, starting with that first unit in Boundary Dam in '89 for CO2 enhanced EOR. Now, I personally have had a long history of about 20 years working for the Canadian federal government. And I first came to SaskPower in 1995, begging for money for a research project on oxygen, CO2 recycled combustion, oxy-fuel combustion that I was building in Ottawa. And a very generous vice president by the name of Tony Harris wrote me a check and joined the consortium in 1995. And that got me the license to build the pilot plant. Then I came back to SaskPower when I had to do a CCS and a clean coal roadmap. And again, one of SaskPower's VPs, Rick Patrick, lent his voice, became the industry lead, and we managed to push a roadmap in early 2000. So all along the way, including all the work that Max Bell and Doug DeVerne did, evaluating the various options for CCS in the early days with a 450 megawatt unit, I think is what you guys were looking at, and many other things, SaskPower has been a leader. It's not been an accident that they are in the position that they are in now. It's been 25 years, folks, of commitment, interest, and pursuing a goal. So well done, SaskPower. You are going to be a very interesting laboratory for the future. Okay, coming down to the business of putting challenges in putting the U in CCS. Well, in various circles, there's a debate about the U in CCS. And depending on who you talk to, the U is about equal, and in some cases, the U is bigger in the whole scheme. So just how much it's of an impact it's going to make is I'm going to take you through my assessment of the situation. First, let's start with utilization. Well, simple English definition will tell you that, well, utilization is to put something to use, especially to find a profit or a profitable outcome or a practical use. In the context of climate change, however, I think it's very important to realize that when we put CO2 to use, a very important caveat is that the CO2 must permanently avoid being emitted into the atmosphere. If you don't have that, you don't have effective utilization. So what's the source of our optimism about CO2 use? Well, this has been the revolution that happened a few billion years ago that changed our world. Essentially, some organisms called cyanobacteria, and this picture is actually of the stromatolites that I found at an ancient lake traveling through Western Australia. Those stromatolites are about 500,000 to 1 million years old. But rumor has it that they were the first organisms that came into being that fixed CO2 in water with the help of sunlight and generated the oxygen in the atmosphere and obviously generated biomass. And that biomass went to sink, which is the source of a lot of our coal and petrochemicals. Obviously, we are reversing the process when we use fossil fuels, not releasing energy back as sunlight, but using it in other forms and putting CO2 and water back into the atmosphere. Okay? So, in order to be successful in utilization, we must, in some fashion, ape this process. Now, if I were to try and draw a diagram that looks at CCS, little US, and sustainability, this is the sort of diagram that I would draw. Well, sequestered carbon, fossil fuels, when we use it, it becomes a source of CO2. We can capture CO2. And if you look to your far right, if we don't tinker with that CO2 molecule and put it to storage, well, we've achieved a sort of limited sustainability, not quite complete sustainability, because the carbon is in a different form. But at least we are limiting some damage to the atmosphere. The other option we have is to your far left, where you use the CO2, you use it to enhance the recovery of oils. You can use it for enhanced coal bed methane recovery, needs to be worked at, enhanced gas recovery. So you push out more fossil fuels, you offset the carbon a little bit, and the fossil fuels become a little greener. Now, the challenge that we face is whether we can go down the middle pathway, and that pathway involves tinkering with the carbon-oxygen bond. In order to be fully sustainable, your energy source has to be non-fossil based. If it is fossil based, you're producing more CO2, and you're not achieving anything useful. Assuming we are successful in doing that, then we can produce fuels and chemicals, and the fuels maybe can be reutilized. And when you reutilize the fuel, you're emitting CO2 back into the atmosphere. But what you've done is, if your energy is a non-fossil source, then you've doubled the flux of energy per molecule of CO2 in the system, essentially. That's what it boils down to. So that's the picture about sustainability. But as I mentioned before, as soon as we start tinkering with the bond, we hit a roadblock called the energy dilemma. This is a plot of the Gibbs free energy, and it looks at various chemical compounds. So I've drawn a line across from CO2. Any molecule above that requires, its synthesis requires the input of energy. You have to put energy in to convert CO2 into any of those chemicals above it. Any of the chemicals below CO2 are ones that will react and give you a little bit of energy in the process that you can recover. So a leading example of that might be the formation of carbonates, where there'll be a net production of energy if you utilize CO2. So you have to be mindful of this when you're starting to tinker with CO2 in the utilization bond. Next comes the chemistry dilemma, and this is to do with the emissions back into the atmosphere. Just about any chemical that you make, depending on how long you keep it in storage, at some point it's going to decay back to CO2. And it depends how fast that happens. So putting CO2 into soft drinks is a very, very, very temporary measure, for example. If you make methanol, you run into a similar problem. If you make another fuel, dimethyl ether, you run into similar problems as well. Now the thing about the carbonates is, often you don't find free sodium or calcium floating around. So in order to work with sodium and calcium, you have to naturally mine carbonates, expel the CO2 before you recombine it again. So you have to be very, very careful in terms of what you do. So these are the two critical elements that you have to look at. So there are a number of things you can do in terms of making chemicals, fuels, all kinds of things. And the problem with this plot is in the middle, you don't start with CO2 and hydrogen, you start with CO and hydrogen. In order to start with CO2 and hydrogen, you need to do this. You need to put in energy to get down those pathways. And that energy, I'm afraid, has got to come from a non-fossil resource. So, several options are available. Most of them are temporary at best. And let's look at the case of urea as an example. This is often one of the things that is touted outside of EOR as something that you can use to utilize CO2. So that's the chemical compound, and what it does is it eventually decays when you use it into CO2, ammonia. Ammonia is oxidized into NO3, and it also releases N2O, which is in itself greenhouse gas. The CO2 may be taken up by plants and roots, but eventually it's lost in the plant cycle when the plant dies or the soil is stilled. So it's a kind of an interesting case. Clearly you have to do some life cycle on it. And if you go back to how we make urea, if you start with coal, you produce a syngas, you're essentially separating CO2, you're using the hydrogen to make ammonia, and then you're reacting the ammonia with the CO2. Except that when you're making ammonia from coal, you use twice as much coal to produce the hydrogen you need in ammonia. So you're producing excess CO2 anyway in the process. If you start from natural gas, which has got more hydrogen, then maybe there's some room to fix CO2. So even if you went down this pathway for urea, I think a couple of big plants in the world will probably saturate this market. It might be good movers, first movers only. So let's look at CO2 for EOR. This is probably the best bet that we have, but even then, we have to be very careful. If you look around the oil field, 50% of the injected CO2 stays in the reservoir, and if you recycle, we get plus 95%. Now, one of the problems we face, which is one of the reasons why we worked early with the IEA GHG Weyburn-Mydale project, is to characterize storage with EOR. There are many applications out there that really don't look at this very seriously. So we have to look at this very seriously to give some credence to this option. If we widen the boundary, then there might be some debate about whether these emissions are still storage. Well, ultimately, you do end up putting some CO2 down for the oil that you produce. So the oil might be, if you like, produced less carbon intensive. But we have to be careful in terms of the steps we take with this. And we know that world oil demand is going to continue to rise. Global emissions from transport are rising. So we have to be very careful to make sure that it's just not a simple temporary emissions transfer. We looked at the potential of CO2 utilization when we persuaded the IPCC in 2005 to write a special report. And then, when we looked at the consumption of CO2, excluding EOR, the potential was about 120 million tons a year. And some of the processes that stored CO2 for several decades. And the century scale storage equated to about 1 million tons a year in the numbers we looked at. For CO2 EOR, looking at light oils only, the estimates that we've come up with in the IEA greenhouse program globally pitches this at 60 to 120 gigatons of CO2. Well, we just saw a plot from Peter Cook earlier on that I think pitched the global emissions currently at about 39 billion tons a year. So that's what we are emitting. And if you look at what the IEA CCS roadmap says that we should achieve by between 2010 and 2030, we've got about 445 gigatons of CO2 to put underground. So if you look at the numbers for utilization as it stands, there are 2 to 3 orders of magnitude difference between the way CO2 is used and the current global production of CO2. Now I take you to a report that was put out by the Global CCS Institute in some work done for the Institute by Parsons Bickenhoff. Essentially what this does is tries to project a market for EOR, and what it draws is a plot, if you like, the gray area of what the IEA expects in terms of a 2-degree scenario, and in order to achieve that, what the carbon prices ought to be. And what this shows is essentially that at some point, if you go down the pathway of increasing carbon prices, the price that you receive for EOR is going to diminish. So, well, at best, it's carbon neutral. There's short-term storage options. In the worst case, they may contribute to global warming, essentially. And so what is utilization adding? It's allowing us, for early movers, to set a price for carbon and demonstration plants. In doing so, we build these plants, gain government acceptance, public acceptance, we support learning, but in the longer term, it's niche. EOR in particular is probably the biggest utilization option we'll have. It's a market stimulator. It's not a solution to climate change. We cannot deny that CO2 emissions are increasing. We need positive global action to stabilize emissions, and we need a higher CO2 price. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. And now I'd like to ask Francis Leneuf to come up and do his chat.
Thank you, Nick. First of all, I'd like to say I'm very happy to be here today to talk about our Weyburn Enhanced Oil Recovery Project. So this slide is really just a reminder that this presentation has estimates and forward-looking information in it. So Cenovus is a Canadian integrated oil company. Cenovus is a relatively new name, but we have a long history in the Canadian oil and gas industry. One of our predecessor companies, Pan Canadian, has its roots dating back to Canadian Pacific Railway, back to 1881. Cenovus is headquartered in Calgary, and we primarily focus on oil, although we do have extensive shallow gas production in Alberta. The majority of our growth is focused on oil in northern Alberta, where we use specialized techniques to drill and pump the oil to the surface. We also have, as I mentioned, gas and conventional oil in southern Alberta, as well as here near in Weyburn, where we have our large EOR CO2 project in Weyburn as a recovery. This slide shows our Weyburn plant and the battery, as well as a picture of the unit outline. It's 22 kilometers south of Weyburn and 135 kilometers southeast of Regina, so not too far from here. We operate the project. It's a fairly large project area, 22,000 hectares, and we will operate the project on behalf of a unit. We're the unit operators, 23 partners in that unit. Our share of the unit is just over 60%. Weyburn is one of Canada's largest enhanced oil recovery operations, and as well as one of the largest CO2 utilization and storage projects. So let's just take a quick walk through some of the geology. So the oil pool is part of the Williston Sedimentary Basin. It's about 1,450 meters deep. The oil is produced from the Midale beds, Mississippi and Charles Formation. The Marley and the Vuggy are the two zones for that. Reservoir is relatively large. It's got 1.4 billion barrels in place, and we've produced about 30% of that at this point in time. Slide shows the unit production through time. Weyburn really has been a poster child for successful EOR recovery. Production began in the mid-1950s and peaked in the 1960s at about 45,000 barrels a day. That was developed basically through the primary and then the waterflood stages of the field development. As production declined, optimization and improved recovery were achieved through vertical and infill phases, and you can see that by the various colors of the wedges there, the production plot. And then in the late 1990s, we established a CO2 EOR scheme. CO2 flooding is expected to extend the life of the Weyburn field by another 30 to 40 years and lead to an estimated 200 million barrels of incremental oil production. Although we've started a CO2 flood, we still use water flooding today and inject about 250,000 barrels a day of saline water for that water flood. Our production's about 26,000 barrels a day. About 60% of the Weyburn field is under CO2 flood. So extending the life of the field isn't just good for Cenovus and our shareholders. It's also good for the economy of Saskatchewan and the economy of southern Saskatchewan where we operate, and investment in the community. We'll be investing in the community for years to come. So really, what is CO2 enhanced oil recovery? In some aspects, the technical details are complex, but really it's a simple concept. Under primary recovery, we use the reservoir's energy and mechanisms to recover some of the oil. Water flooding uses injected saline water to basically sweep the oil, more of that oil, to the producers. For CO2 EOR flooding, it's really just like using a solvent to wash the rock. The CO2 is injected as a liquid, a high-pressure liquid, and washes the oil between the pore spaces. It effectively lowers the viscosity of the oil, and it swells the oil so that it expands out of the pore spaces. So simple concept, really. The CO2 and water are produced back with the oil. They are then separated and then re-injected. This technique has been used in the enhanced oil recovery process since the 1960s, and it's quite common in the United States. So what are a few considerations on the supply side for CO2? First, a large supply of high-quality CO2 is required, 95% pure as a minimum. It also must be stable and secure as a supply. Additionally, since EOR schemes are inherently expensive, another important element is the total cost to get the CO2 to the field gate and then down to the reservoir. At the start of our project, we came to an arrangement with Dakota Gasification Company in Beulah for a CO2 supply. DGC built a pipeline that brings high-quality compressed gas from Beulah to our Weyburn project. They still own and operate the pipeline, which delivers CO2 to our Weyburn project, as well as to Apache for their CO2 enhanced oil recovery program near Midale. The first CO2 injected into our reservoir at Weyburn was achieved in October of 2000. First off, I'd like to congratulate SaskPower on their successful Boundary Dam carbon capture project. This new supply will ensure that we have a consistent and adequate supply of CO2, which is critical to maintaining and expanding our CO2 enhanced recovery project in Weyburn. In 2012, Cenovus signed an agreement with SaskPower for CO2 from their Boundary Dam project. And as part of that overall project, Cenovus constructed a 66-kilometer pipeline from Boundary Dam to our Weyburn facility. So to date, about 22 million tons of CO2 has been safely used at Weyburn since 2000. And really another aspect that I can comment on is this project, as well as Apache's EOR project, may be the most studied oil fields in the world. The CO2 monitoring and storage project was a collaboration between 6 governments, 9 industry participants, and many research institutes. The project has been managed by PRTC. The first phase verified the reservoir could safely and economically contain the CO2, while the second phase, which was just completed in 2012, resulted in the publication of best practice manual for CO2 geological storage and a guide for field implementation. So really, what does the future hold? I think we need to continue to move ahead on many of these fronts. Working with EOR as a demonstration and kind of a synergy between the oil industry and the power generation is a key aspect. Several other aspects I think we have to move ahead on, and we've talked about many of them today, and making progress I think is a key factor for us all. Thank you.
Thank you, Francis. That's good. Thank you. And now I'd like to ask Dr. John Morano from GM Energy to come up and continue the chat of utilization.
Well, good afternoon. So we're going to try to keep you awake today. I want to thank SaskPower for inviting me to the conference, and I want to acknowledge, thank National Energy Technology Laboratory for getting me here, and also some of the things that I have a disclaimer like some other people at the end, but since I'm my own company, it's a lot shorter. So what I want to do today, I think what you're going to hear, I agree with a lot that Kelly said. I don't really disagree with any of that. But what I want to share with you is, first, I want to really just give you an overview of what people are talking about in a little bit more specific way, and then really talk about, why I think it's a good idea. Now, I've spent 35 years of my career primarily in fossil energy, oil and gas, then I got involved with coal. When I started in my career, I heard about these things about climate change and things, and I'll be honest with you, I was a skeptic, okay, primarily because of the modeling at that time, the quality of the modeling. I'm not a skeptic anymore. I was around, I wasn't involved at PETC, which is now NETL. I was not involved with the initial planning of the carbon capture program, sequestration program, but I remember at the time being skeptical of that. I knew you could do EOR. I didn't think you'd want to do it for anything else, okay? And I think SaskPower is really, has shown or is showing that, I was wrong. So about 5 years ago, I was asked to look a little bit into the utilization effort. And at the time, I was skeptical. I'm not skeptical anymore. I think it's a critical part of this. I don't think it's the total solution. And I think it's important in a conference like this is that we tend to focus that we're going to solve the whole problem. And that's not really the case. I like to look at it in terms of the wedges. Multiple things are going to have to happen for us to stabilize climate. It's not all going to be the power sector, okay? Themes of the talk, we're already doing it. No free lunch, third wave, build it and they will come, and then markets have to be found. A lot of this has been said, so I can skip over it, so that's the nice part of it. I have a much more elaborate definition, okay? But basically what's different there is I've just broken it into two things. You can either chemically convert it or what I call use it as a working fluid. So EOR is a working fluid. I consider everything that's not conversion a working fluid, so a solvent, et cetera. And again, iterate that just because it's beneficial reuse doesn't mean that the carbon's going to stay there for any amount of time, for a long time. And what I'm going to focus on, so we've had a talk about EOR. I will mention EOR a little bit, but I'm going to focus more on this idea of carbon recycle and reuse. Okay, we're already doing it. I look at it, and I'm going to use this as an example. U.S. 2012, the U.S. consumed 14.2 billion gallons of renewable fuels. I think that's a lot in everybody's book, approximately 10% of the gasoline market. It was produced from biomass that absorbs CO2 from air at 392 parts per million. And if you do the math, half of that carbon was up there is a result of the industrial revolution, okay, since then. So when you grow in particular here, if you grow corn, you're using fossil carbon because we've already put extra carbon in the atmosphere. So where does that take us? Well, right now that's about 0.01 gigatons of carbon per year. It's not that much. It's also not that renewable, so the benefit is much smaller. But again, the renewable fuels industry is also evolving, just like CCS is evolving. So they have a lot of room to improve and make greener low-carbon fuels. And I think I would change this to say when we meet the renewable fuel standard. I don't think it's in the U.S. I don't think it's going to be in 2022. If the program's continued, it's going to go up 0.03 to 0.05 gigatons recycled, okay? One of the goals of the Department of Energy, sister organization to the fossil energy, is to get to 1 billion tons, and they've done studies to show that. So that's like an order of magnitude greater. So it has a contribution to make, and it's a contribution really, in this case, towards addressing the mobile sources. And my point here is that right now this new industry, biofuels, is using air for their CO2 source. As an engineer, I think I'm smart enough that if I have 4 to 15% CO2 in a flue gas stream, that's the preferred source. What I want to do now is really tell you a little bit more about the pathways to CO2 conversion, and there's really two major ways to do that. We have chemical conversion, so that's your sort of your traditional chemistry with catalysts, and then you have a biological route, so that's where algae and other things come into play. And then you also have, there's really a lot of different ways that people are looking at this problem, but there's also hybrid technology. So if you use an enzyme, okay, it's not an organism, but it might have come from an organism. Now, in these pathways, it really boils down to 3 different flavors of CO2 conversion, and Kelly talked about this. There's mineralization, okay, so that's reacting, you're actually oxidizing the CO2 when you do that. So there's the potential to have a slight exothermic, probably a slight exothermic reaction, so you're getting some energy out. There's functionalization, okay? That's adding CO2 to chemicals. So most of the chemicals we use are polymers, are organic compounds, or built from organic compounds. So if you use CO2 as the source of that oxygen, you have the potential of improving the efficiency while consuming some CO2 in the process. And then really sort of the holy grail is carbon activation, okay? So that's reducing CO2 and growing hydrocarbon chains, okay? And the example of that, so that's a very endothermic process, and the example of that is again Fischer-Tropsch synthesis would fall into that category. Now, I won't go into this. Kelly did an excellent job talking about the energetics of this. So there's no free lunch, okay? When would this make sense, okay? Well, if you require energy for endothermic reactions or for any of the supporting processes, okay, you have to have an outside source of energy. So I've seen a lot of schemes where the power plant produces the energy to make the chemicals from the CO2, and that's not possible, okay? So in that case, you need to have a renewable source, or a nuclear energy would work for that. But you also have, in the case when you're making other products other than fuels, the possibility of efficiency improvements by using CO2. So again, in making organic chemicals, you're wanting to add oxygen. So CO2 could be a source of that oxygen, and it could improve the efficiency of the process. And there's companies working on that. In particular, Europe, I think, is ahead on that. Bayer is involved in that, doing work in that area. You have a source of fossil-derived CO2, okay? I like to say there's enough CO2 for everybody. So arguing about, do we do this with it or that is not the point. We have plenty of CO2 to work with if we're going to use it for something. Higher the concentration is better, and then stationary versus mobile. I've seen concepts where people try to use CO2 from cars and stuff like that, and that may be possible, but that's, you would go after the easy CO2 first, right? And then you have to have useful products, and what you want there is a long shelf life and a large market, and those two things sort of don't they counter each other. So if you're making a lot of stuff, it's usually cheaper, has lower value. What I want to do here really is just walk you through, the kinds of things you can do, and I do have a slide here on EOR. And what I looked at when we were doing this was, what was the greatest potential? But I think you also have to look at the economics. So if anything that's going to help mitigate climate change, it's going to allow carbon capture systems and sequestration to move forward, is positive. So if you're making a small amount of a valuable material, it could improve the economics of the situation. So there are some utilities in the U.S. that are looking at this as the low-hanging fruit. So if you regulate me and you say you have to do 30, 40% CO2 reduction, if 5% or 10% of that, they can do it with some useful product, okay, and make it work, that's just lowers the cost of capture. Now, my focus has been on the biological conversion, but I don't want to leave you with the idea that that's the only one or that that's the preferred one. So these aren't in any order. Biological conversion to liquid fuels, chemicals, and food. This is a term, one of the issues with biofuels is, you always hear, is food versus fuel. Well, if you talk to people in the advanced biofuels industry, really nascent industry, and especially the algae companies involved in algae development, they say food and fuel, okay? And they're not talking about necessarily we want to eat the algae, but a high-value product is feed for the production, and primarily meat and fish. So, okay. So that really is, if we go outside of enhanced oil recovery, which again is commercial and it's has economics and it's technically possible. Algae is probably the closest. I see some demo plants really coming in the 5 to 10 years, and the economics is driven like the economics of CCS. It's a regulatory-driven thing, basically by low-carbon fuel standards. So there's a driver for that. You can do that chemically, the same thing. Interestingly, nature is better at it than man is at this point, so chemical conversion is a longer-term thing when you hear people talking about reducing CO2 and things, electrochemically, those kinds of things. And again, functionalization is a small niche, but if you're a bear or a chemical producer and you have to reduce your emissions, it's not a small thing to you, right? And then finally, mineralization. And mineralization has the benefit that it does have this aspect of it that it's a storage option. And the other thing that we've been thinking about really is that if we start looking, there's an interest now to start looking at adaptation. And I think we're going to have to do adaptation. I don't think we're going to meet these targets anytime soon, okay? So one of the things, if you really look at the sea level rise, the potential in the next 100 years, there's going to be a need for a lot of materials for dikes and things like that to protect coastlines. Now, how do we get there? This is the thing that I think is really important, whether it's carbon capture or CO2 conversion, is we have to have continued innovation. I call this the third wave, okay? If we look at petrochemicals, the biggest market for chemical market, chemicals started out, the innovation, inorganic chemicals was in the 1800s, late 1800s. So there was a wave of innovation. That was followed with petrochemicals. And we're really now in a wave that's driven by nanotechnology and biotechnology. It's amazing the things they can do, and you have to have some faith that they will be able to do other things with it. So we don't know where that's going. I think it's worth the R&D to look at it. But, and I don't have time to talk about it, but the things that they're able to do now with some of the organisms to make them produce fuels from sunlight and excrete finished products is amazing. It's got a relatively long time frame, but again, climate change, addressing this, we're talking on a 100-year time frame. Finish up really just talking about the future. So the way I look at it, scale of CCUS today, CO2 is a stranded asset in most cases. If you can't move it around, you can't use it for anything, okay? You can sequester it. We have some plants now looking at EOR to do that, okay? What we need in the future is to connect this up, okay? The driver here is that if you can't get something to a market, it's not worth anything. So I liken this to like building the transcontinental railroad in the U.S. and in Canada. The idea was to connect the east and west coast, and the result was build it and they will come. So now I'll finish up. One of the things I wanted to mention was making CO2 capture affordable. So conceptually, we can talk about the cost of conversion and capture, okay? And we may never get to the point where the value of CO2 captured is greater than the cost of the CO2 to capture the CO2. That might be a pipe dream, but anything that we can do in the near term to move things forward is a valuable thing to do, okay? We're not moving fast enough, and these are the kind of things that I believe will get more acceptance to the problem. And I want to finish up with, I'm going to paraphrase Marcus Samuel, who was the founder of Shell, and he was talking about crude oil at the turn of the last century, okay? And to paraphrase him, the mere capture of CO2 is also its least valuable and least interesting state. Markets and technologies to support them have to be found. So that's where we're at with utilization, in my opinion. Again, there's my acknowledgments. I want to thank NETL for the support, continued support to look at this. There's my disclaimer. And then I have to thank, as as a goodwill, unofficial goodwill ambassador from the city of Pittsburgh, I want to thank the host country, Canada. We have three cups, and those are the two of the players that had the really big impact on that. So, with that, I'm done. So.
Thank you, John. We're going to move to questions, so if anyone has a question, please go up to the mic. I'm going to ask the first question to Kelly. Kelly, what is the potential for CO2 utilization in your opinion?
The greatest potential I see is the ones that don't tinker with the carbon-hydrogen bond, and that by that I mean things like EOR, things like enhanced gas recovery, things like enhanced coal methane recovery. They are straight no-brainers, basically, in terms of what you can use CO2 for. There are the chemistry routes that kind of convert things to carbonates, meaning when you react CO2 with something else, it releases energy in the process of the conversion. They are potentials that I would put my money in. And in that category, there might be, the minerals, there might be the polycarbonates that, you could sort of develop. Yeah, I'll buy that. But I caution the mineralization route also requires some assets. There's some energy expenditures involved with, making that happen. So one has to do the sums. So these are the large potential items that I see. But my dilemma is when we look at the scale of the emissions and we look at the scale of utilization, 2 to 3 orders of magnitude difference. And I think we face enough challenges in getting CCS on the road at the moment that I just don't want to run down a rabbit hole when we should be tackling the bigger task without distractions.
I guess I should respond. I think, from the standpoint of this, let's say, I don't distinguish between EOR and other aspects, except that it's more immediate, okay? But I think one of the things that because I have worked in carbon capture, okay? I think to some extent, we should be agnostic towards, utilization. As long as somebody can show that they're making a positive impact, I think we should be agnostic, and we should look at them as allies, okay? Now, when you get into things like funding and stuff for research programs, there's still I've been around a while, and there's competition for R&D funding, definitely. But a lot of this work is really not being funded specifically, to get rid of coal or anything like that. It's really being funded, some of it's national security, some of it's climate related, but it's fuels, biofuels related. So, there's the potential to collaborate. So I think it's valuable to think of them as people looking at utilization as allies, and really look at what they're trying to do and whether it has some benefit. I mean, you're definitely better off if you're not releasing it again. But if it moves things forward, if it makes the first plant, the second plant, third plant a little bit cheaper, I think that's a very positive thing.
Okay, thank you. Quick question for Francis. Does EOR have greater global application? Like, can the opportunity here, BD, be expanded?
I believe it can, absolutely. There is additional opportunity globally. But as we've talked about, it's complicated. It's complicated from the producer's perspective. There's risk. There's capital expenditure. And a lot has to do with time and space. If you have the supply close enough to the fields. But I think it falls into the category of, and it's not going to be the catch-all for anything. It's not going to solve the whole issue. I think it's just part of the solution. And I think it, fundamentally, I think we just have to move ahead on some of these things and really push them ahead, and they will advance other fronts for us. So I think that is another benefit for us all.
Well, that's going to, so I'd like to thank our panel on this. So on behalf of everyone, thank you.